Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on emotional intelligence.
EQ, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
EQ. We're going beyond just the buzzword though, and
Mhm.
really trying to understand it.
It really has become such a buzzword.
It really has.
Everyone's talking about it.
They are. But we're going to unpack it with two really, really smart people. Experts, I guess you could say.
Daniel
Goleman, of course, a pioneer in the field.
Exactly. So that's really cool. And then Justin Bariso.
And he's really interesting because he brings in these concrete examples.
Yeah, real world applications, right?
Yes, exactly.
So it's not just theory.
Right.
It's like, how does this actually play out
Exactly.
in real life?
Yeah, and you've picked such interesting sources for this deep dive. I mean, Goleman's book, it's like the Bible of EQ.
Yeah, it lays the groundwork for sure. It does. It really does. And then Bariso brings in those amazing stories.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so interesting about Goleman is that he says that EQ is not just this like
Touchy-feely.
yeah, like soft skill. Yeah, like it's not just for like therapists to talk about.
Right.
He calls it like a meta ability.
Uh-huh.
And he really argues that it impacts
all of our other abilities.
yeah, like our IQ even.
And that's huge because for so long, we thought IQ was it, right? Like if you had a high IQ, you were set.
You were golden.
But Goleman really challenges that notion.
He does, and he says you can have all this brain power, essentially.
Right.
But if you don't have the emotional intelligence to kind of go with it.
To harness it, right. It's what good is it?
Yeah, it's like having this really fast car,
okay,
but not knowing how to drive it.
I like that. You're going to crash.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, having all the ingredients for an amazing cake, but not the actual recipe to put it all together.
I love that analogy because you can have all the right ingredients, but if you don't know how to combine them in the right way, disaster.
Exactly. And Goleman, he gives these examples, right, of these people who have
sky-high IQs.
Yeah.
And they're struggling.
They're like failing at life.
In their personal lives, professional lives, because they lack that EQ.
And it's so interesting because you think, like, how is that possible?
Right, because logically they should have it all figured out, right? But it's like their emotions are a mystery to them.
Yeah, and to other people, too.
Exactly.
It's like they can't connect with other people.
And Goleman talks about this one patient, Elliot, right?
Oh, yeah, Elliot. What a story.
Tell me you don't get chills when you read about him.
So this guy, Elliot, he had this...
a brain tumor.
Brain tumor.
And they removed it.
They did.
But afterwards, something was different.
It's like he was missing something.
It was like a part of him was gone.
Like he could remember things logically. He could tell you what happened to him.
But he couldn't feel it.
Yeah. He was like he was reading from a textbook or something.
Exactly. And it's like, how can you go through life like that?
I know. It's like, what's the point almost?
Right. I mean, emotions are what make us human, you know?
Yeah, they are. They make life exciting and interesting, even though some of them are not so fun.
Definitely not. But they're all part of the experience.
Yeah, they are. They make us who we are.
We do.
So how do we, what is this EQ thing? How do we break it down?
Well, luckily, Goleman gives us this framework. He breaks down emotional intelligence into 4 core abilities, or pillars, if you will.
4 pillars.
Pillars of EQ.
Okay, so 4 pillars of EQ. I like that.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because he's giving us a way to understand and measure this thing that can seem kind of elusive, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
So the first pillar, and this one's crucial, is self-awareness.
Okay, so knowing yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Knowing your own emotions as they happen.
Okay.
And understanding how they impact your thoughts and actions.
Okay, so like if you're feeling stressed.
Exactly.
You're aware that you're stressed, and you know that that might make you like snap at your coworker.
Precisely. Or make a bad decision.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So self-awareness is like the foundation.
Yeah, okay, so what's the next pillar?
The next one is self-management.
Okay, so how you handle those feelings then?
Exactly. So it's one thing to be aware of your emotions, but it's another thing entirely to be able to manage them effectively.
So not just like ignoring them or pushing them down, but actually like dealing with them in a healthy way.
You got it. It's about finding healthy coping mechanisms, learning how to regulate your emotional responses, and not letting your feelings control your behavior.
So like if you're feeling angry, instead of yelling at someone, you might take a few deep breaths, go for a walk, or do something else to kind of de-escalate the situation.
Exactly. And that's where self-management comes in. It's about having those tools in your back pocket and knowing how to use them when things get tough.
Okay, so we've got self-awareness and self-management. What about the other two pillars?
Right, so the next two pillars shift the focus outward to our interactions with other people. The third pillar is social awareness.
Okay, so that's like being aware of other people's emotions.
You got it. It's the ability to empathize with others, to accurately pick up on their emotions and understand their perspectives, even if they're different from your own.
It's like being able to read the room, kind of.
Exactly. It's about being tuned in to the emotional landscape around you and responding in a way that's sensitive and appropriate.
Okay, so social awareness is about understanding other people's emotions. What about the last pillar?
The fourth and final pillar is relationship management.
So this is where it all comes together.
Exactly. Relationship management is about using all those other skills, self-awareness, self-management, and social awareness, to build and maintain strong, healthy relationships with others.
So it's like taking all that internal work we've been doing and applying it to our interactions in the world.
I love that because it really is about finding that balance between understanding ourselves and understanding others, and then using that understanding to create positive, meaningful connections.
That makes sense. But how do our brains actually process all of this emotional information? I mean, he can feel so overwhelming sometimes, like we're being pulled in a million different directions at once.
Well, that's where Goleman brings in this fascinating concept called the amygdala hijack. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, tell me you're about to talk about those moments where we just completely lose our cool.
Exactly. Like when you snap at someone you love or say something you instantly regret because you're stressed, tired, or caught off guard.
Oh, yeah, like when you're running late for work and you spill coffee all over yourself.
Yeah.
Not my finest moment.
We've all been there. And Goleman explains that this happens when our amygdala, which is like our brain's alarm system, perceives a threat.
A threat. Like a tiger chasing us.
Well, not necessarily a tiger, but you get the idea. It could be anything that triggers a stress response, like a work deadline, a traffic jam, or even just a disagreement with a loved one.
Okay, so our amygdala sounds kind of overprotective, like that friend who freaks out over every little thing.
It kind of is, but here's the thing. When the amygdala senses danger, it triggers a fight or flight response before our more rational thinking brain can even process what's happening.
So basically, our emotional brain hits the gas, while our thinking brain is still trying to figure out where the car keys are.
That's a great way to put it. And that's when we get hijacked, when our emotions take over and we react in ways that we later regret.
So what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know about you, but I'd rather not let my amygdala call all the shots.
Well, that's where those other pillars of EQ come in, especially self-awareness and self-management.
Okay, but how do we actually put those into practice, especially in the heat of the moment?
That's what we'll uncover in part 2. It's about learning to hit the brakes.
Easier said than done, right?
It is. It takes practice. But we can train our brains to respond more effectively to those emotional triggers.
So it's not about like suppressing our emotions altogether, but more about
Managing them.
managing them.
Yes.
Okay, I like that, managing them.
Yeah.
So what are some ways we can actually do that? Because, it's one thing to talk about it theoretically, but in the moment, when your amygdala is going haywire, it's like, okay, now what?
Well, both Goleman and Bariso give us some really practical tools. One that I find really helpful is mindfulness.
Mindfulness, okay.
And it's not as complicated as it sounds. It's really just about paying attention to your emotions as they arise.
So like noticing those physical sensations like your heart racing or your palms getting sweaty.
Exactly. Those are like your body's early warning signals that a hijack is about to happen.
Okay, so we notice those signals.
Yeah.
Then what? Do we like try to ignore them?
No, not ignore them, because that doesn't really work. It's more about acknowledging them, accepting that they're there, but not letting them dictate your actions.
So instead of letting our emotions control us, we're kind of taking back the reins.
Precisely. We're creating a little space between the feeling and the reaction.
It's like hitting the pause button.
Exactly. That pause, that's where our power lies.
Because then we have a choice.
Right. We can choose how we want to respond rather than just reacting on autopilot.
And sometimes that pause might just be a few deep breaths.
Right. Absolutely. Deep breathing is one of the simplest yet most effective ways to regulate our nervous system and calm down those fight or flight responses.
It's like hitting the reset button on our brains.
Exactly. And Bariso talks about how important it is to have a whole toolkit of coping mechanisms, not just one.
A cool kid. Okay. So what else can we put in our emotional toolbox?
Well, it's really about finding what works best for you. Some people find exercise really helpful. Others might turn to music or spending time in nature.
Yeah, those are all great ways to kind of shift your energy.
Exactly. And having a plan in place for when those challenging emotions inevitably arise can make all the difference.
It's like having a fire drill for our feelings. We don't wait for the fire to start practicing our escape route, right?
I love that analogy. It's about being prepared so when those intense emotions show up, we know exactly what to do.
Okay, so we've talked about self-awareness and self-management. But what about those other two pillars of EQ, the ones that involve other people?
Right, social awareness and relationship management.
Those feel a little trickier, honestly, because now we're not just dealing with our own emotions, but other people's too.
They definitely add another layer of complexity, but they're also where the real magic of EQ comes into play.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, with social awareness, it all starts with empathy,
Empathy, okay.
which is really just the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person.
So like putting yourself in their shoes.
Exactly. Trying to see the world from their perspective, even if it's different from your own.
And that's not always easy, especially if you disagree with someone.
It's definitely not always easy, but it's essential for building strong, healthy relationships.
So how do we actually practice empathy, especially when we're feeling triggered or defensive?
Well, one of the most powerful things we can do is to really listen to the other person.
Okay, but not just like waiting for our turn to talk, right?
Right. It's about active listening, which means really paying attention to what the other person is saying, both verbally and nonverbally.
So like noticing their tone of voice, their body language.
Exactly. All of those things communicate so much more than just words. And it's about asking clarifying questions, trying to really understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
It's like we're detectives, trying to gather all the clues to understand the full story.
I love that because it really is about approaching the conversation with a sense of curiosity and a genuine desire to understand. And that kind of curiosity can go a long way in diffusing tension and building connection.
Okay, so let's say we've tapped into that social awareness. We're listening, we're empathizing. How do we actually use that to build stronger relationships? That's where relationship management comes in.
Yeah. Exactly. And one of the most important aspects of relationship management is effective communication.
Communication, okay. But that feels so broad. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's about learning how to express your own needs and feelings clearly and assertively.
Okay, so not just like bottling everything up or being a pushover.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between being honest about your own needs and being respectful of the other person's feelings.
So it's about finding that balance between honesty and empathy.
You got it. And it's about learning how to navigate disagreements constructively.
Yeah.
Because disagreements are inevitable in any relationship, but it's how we handle them that determines whether they bring us closer together or drive us further apart.
And that probably involves some of those self-regulation skills we were talking about earlier, right? Like taking a pause before we say something we regret.
Absolutely. Those self-management skills are crucial for navigating those tricky interpersonal dynamics. And it's also about being willing to compromise to find win-win solutions that work for both people.
Okay, so we've got honesty, empathy, compromise. Anything else?
Well, Bariso also talks a lot about the importance of giving and receiving feedback effectively.
Oh yeah, feedback. That can be a tough one. It's easy to get defensive or to shy away from it altogether.
It definitely can be a delicate dance, but when done well, feedback can be incredibly valuable for strengthening relationships.
So how do we get better at both giving and receiving feedback?
Well, for starters, it's helpful to remember that feedback isn't about attacking someone or pointing out their flaws. It's about helping them to grow and improve and to see things from a different perspective.
Okay, so it's about having good intentions, basically. But what about the actual delivery? Because even with the best of intentions, feedback can still land in a way that's hurtful or unhelpful.
Right, and that's where some of those communication skills come in. When giving feedback, it's important to be specific, to focus on behaviors rather than making broad generalizations.
So instead of saying, you're always late, you might say, I noticed you were 15 minutes late to our last 3 meetings.
Exactly. That's much more specific and less likely to trigger defensiveness. And it's about framing feedback in a way that's constructive, focusing on solutions rather than just pointing out problems.
So instead of saying, you really messed that up,
Right.
you might say, I see how that situation could have been handled differently. Next time, maybe we could try. And then offer a suggestion.
Perfect. That's a great example of how to give feedback in a way that's both honest and helpful. And when you're on the receiving end of feedback, it's equally important to listen with an open mind, try to understand the other person's perspective, and resist the urge to get defensive.
Because even if we don't agree with the feedback, there's always something to be learned from it.
Absolutely. And often, the feedback that stings the most is the feedback that holds the greatest potential for growth.
It's almost like if we know how to improve these skills, why wouldn't we teach them to everyone?
And that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, should emotional intelligence be taught in schools?
Right, alongside math and history and all that.
Ex-
It seems like it would make a huge difference.
It really does. And you know what? There's a growing movement to do just that.
Really.
Oh, yeah. SEL, social and emotional learning, they call it.
SEL.
Okay,
So-
gaining traction.
So it's like not just this fringe idea anymore.
No, not at all. Because people are realizing that these skills are crucial.
Yeah, if you want to have a successful life, you got to be able to,
Navigate your emotions.
and connect with people.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, it's like, what's the point of all this knowledge?
Right.
If you can't even, like, have a decent conversation with someone.
Or be in a healthy relationship.
Right, exactly. It's like we're finally realizing that being smart isn't just about, your IQ.
It's about the whole package.
Yeah, it's about being emotionally intelligent, too.
Yeah,
And that's something we can all work on,
absolutely.
no matter how old we are or where we're starting from.
And that's such an empowering message, right?
It really is.
That we have the power to change, to grow, to become more emotionally intelligent.
I love that. Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It really has. We've covered so much ground.
We have, from those amygdala hijacks.
Which, by the way, I'm pretty sure I had one this morning.
Oh, tell me about it.
We can save that for another time.
Okay, next episode.
Deal.
Deal. But seriously, we talked about the amygdala hijack, the 4 pillars of EQ,
Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management.
all those things. And you know what? I feel like I actually learned something today.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I always learn something new when we dive into these topics.
That's like you think you know something, and then you really unpack it.
And you realize there's so much more to discover.
Exactly. So for anyone listening who's feeling inspired to learn more about emotional intelligence,
Then who isn't at this point?
yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to improve their EQ after this?
Seriously.
I highly recommend checking out both of these books.
Absolutely.
Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence.
Classic.
It is a class. It's like the OG of EQ books.
It really is.
And then Justin Bariso's EQ Applied.
Which is so great for those real-world examples.
Yes, exactly. Because it shows you how these principles actually play out in real life.
And who doesn't love a good story, right?
Exactly. And these are stories that can actually help us to live better lives.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, our amazing expert, for joining me on this deep dive into emotional intelligence.
It's been a pleasure as always. I love talking about this stuff.
Me too. And I'm sure our listeners do too.
I hope so.
So to all of you out there in podcast land, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another episode, another deep dive into a topic that matters.
Until then, keep learning, keep growing.
And keep exploring.